view of God, a God who is just and holy and sovereign and powerful, the greater and more glorious will be our view of the incarnation. Think about it this way. It's that God and that man. How can you bring those two together? But the incarnation does. Jesus said that his kingdom is not of this world. You've heard that text many times. That would seem to relieve Rome of its worries about the Christian movement, for Rome's kingdom was very much of this world. Yet Jesus' kingdom had everything to do with this world, too, as his own ministry demonstrated. His kingdom embodied a larger vision of reality, the reality of God's just and merciful rule over all of life. It transcended this world, to be sure, but it also bled into it and would ultimately transform it. His kingdom did not threaten Rome in a subversive way. You can find no evidence of early Christianity as a subversive movement, at least as we would normally define subversion. And yet it was far more subversive for that very reason. It's dripping with irony when you think about it. Rome had no idea how to suppress the Christian movement. And they tried everything. I mean, not just persecution, but they would mock it. They would kind of send their intellectual top dogs against it and write against it. I mean, there was this, I mentioned him before, Celsus in the late 2nd century, who wrote a book against Christianity. Why bother? In my mind, it was a waste of his time, but he knew. He knew. Something was troubling about it. Christians didn't accommodate to Rome, as I've already said. Christians didn't isolate from Rome, but they immersed themselves in the empire as followers of Jesus and agents of the kingdom, influencing it both within as individuals and as a community. They announced that there was a truer way to believe and a better way to live than the first way, Roman paganism, the second way, rabbinic Judaism. They believed that this third way, third race, was in fact the only way. Luke says, or actually Luke did not say, a Roman official said that this movement was turning the world upside down. What a telling phrase that is. Upside down can mean more than one thing. It not only describes the impact of the Christian movement, it describes the movement itself. It was upside down. How God came was upside down. The movement that emerged from it was upside down. How early Christians lived was upside down. Everything was upside down. I'm going to use the 2nd century text to illustrate the point. Some of you know how much I love this text. And there are a couple of reasons why. The primary one is that it's short. And I like short texts. I love to assign this for that very reason. People can actually ponder it and think about it. You read some of these later apologists like Justin Martyr. You want to say after a while, will you just shut up, please? It's too much. You could have tightened that argument up by 50 or 100 pages. This man does that. And I'm conjecturing that he wrote it earlier rather than later, maybe 150. It's the first apologetic work we have. And because of its shortness and its kind of crude argument against pagans and Jews, my guess it was early. But it is supremely elegant. I mean, it shows that Christianity was beginning to reach an intellectual class of people because of the superiority of this prose. We don't know the author. We do know the recipient, a so-called Diognetus, who might have been a Roman official. And the author, in his prose, in his argument, demonstrates that that Diognetus knew quite a bit about Christianity. And he's puzzled by it. And he calls it a movement that was creating a third race of people. Not Roman, not Jewish, but something brand new that Rome had not seen before. There was the first way, Roman religion. The second way, Judaism. Religion was transactional, pluralistic, ubiquitous, dominant, and absorptive of other religions. Kind of like an amoeba in a lot of ways. The second way, Judaism, was monotheistic, ancient, ethical, ritualistic, demanding, and honorable. Rome actually respected Jews and gave them some breaks, like tax breaks. But it was just isolated enough from the culture not to pose the kind of menace that Rome thought Christianity did. Well, he explains the uniqueness of the Christian movement first by describing Christian behavior. It's interesting, he doesn't start with Christian belief. He starts with Christian behavior because that's what Diognetus knew most. He could observe how Christians lived, and he was fascinated by it. Where did this come from? Why did they live the way they do? I'm quoting now. Oh, this prose is so good, honestly. I'm jealous of this man. For Christians cannot be distinguished from the rest of the human race by country or language or customs. In other words, you won't spot them when you're walking down the street. They look like everybody else. They do not live in cities of their own. They do not use a peculiar form of speech. They do not follow an eccentric manner of life. The doctrine of theirs has not been discovered by the ingenuity or deep thought of inquisitive men. In other words, it didn't come from the philosophers. Nor do they put forward a merely human teaching, as some do. Yet, although they live in Greek and barbarian cities alike, as each man's lot has been cast, in other words, just where they landed in birth or a move, and follow the customs of the country in clothing and food and other matters of daily living, at the same time they give proof of the remarkable and admittedly extraordinary constitution of their own, oh, this is a killer word, commonwealth, oikumene. It's a new kind of empire. They live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They have a share in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Best line right here. Every foreign land is their fatherland. And yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. Every foreign land is their fatherland. And yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. I'm a Christian who happens to live in America. I'm not an American Christian. There is no such thing. I'm just a Christian. This is my home. I pray for it. I want to serve it. But not really my home. He continues, they busy themselves on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, but in their own lives, they go beyond what the law requires. Then he set out to explain what kind of belief system inspired or formed this kind of behavior. Such a unique way of life grew out of the unique identity of the Christian God as seen and known in the face of Jesus Christ. The author used a rhetorical question to highlight the strange way God chose to reveal himself as Jesus. It didn't follow the typical religious storyline of how the divine appears to humans. I'm quoting again. Now, did God send him, Jesus, as a human mind might assume? He's referring to the Roman mythology here, isn't he? All the other stories about God's coming to us. As a human mind might assume, to rule by tyranny, fear, and terror. Far from it. He sent him out of kindness and gentleness, like a king sending his son, who is himself a king. He sent him as God. He sent him as man to men. I mean, is that an early Christology or what? He willed to save a man by persuasion, not by compulsion. For compulsion is not God's way of working in the world. In sending him, God called men, but did not pursue them, or better put, chase them down. He sent him in love, not in judgment. Now, I'm going to guess this is written maybe 150. Christian movement is still very small. It was not until the year 312 that Christianity became the legal religion in the Roman Empire, and shortly after that it began to become the privileged religion in the empire. And finally, in 380, the official religion of the empire. Scholars estimate that there were about 5,000 Christians, nearly all Jews, in, say, 40 AD. About 5 million, nearly all Gentiles, on the eve of the last great persecution of Christians under the Emperor Diocletian around the year 300. So that movement grew steadily and slowly. That brings hope for all of us, in my opinion, slowly for about 270 years. Rome was at turns dismissive, curious, hostile, ruthless in how they dealt with it. I mentioned at my dinner table that April 30, 304, today's date, marks the beginning of the bloody persecution of Christians, inspired actually by Galerius, not by Diocletian. He passed it off to Diocletian. And this last one was so brutal that observers said the lions got tired of killing Christians and would just sit down and take naps. They were fascinated by it. They were rattled by it. Rome knew how to absorb or squash most movements. Christianity was another matter altogether. They weren't insurrectionists. They couldn't use the sword. They even tried brutal persecution. It didn't work. They didn't set out to overthrow Rome, grow the church into a dominant institution, court the emperor's favor, advocate a reformed agenda to the surprise of Roman critics, change Roman institutions. They didn't try to send people to serve in the Senate. The impact of this new faith was an unintended consequence of something else, something far more important. It was how they viewed God through Jesus Christ. That led to their third way. Christians lived in the Roman world, but they lived much like their fellow Romans, regardless of the positions they occupied in the social order, but they belonged to another kingdom and swore allegiance to another king, or so they claimed. And that alternative kingdom, as I said, was spiritual in nature, and yet it had everything to do with this world. It was simply a different kind of religion altogether. It didn't control the territory. It never recruited a conventional army, never formed a political organization. It could not point to or boast of any kind of material presence. It's startling when you tour a city like Ephesus, there's no material remains of Christianity at all until the 5th century. Nothing. And yet we know that the Christian movement set off a riot in that city when Paul was there, as told in I think it's Acts 19. And yet, what did they do? You know what they were? Not dead stones you build buildings with, they were living stones. They were ubiquitous and hidden. The movement consisted of people who called Jesus Lord, worshiped him, trusted him, followed him, and imitated him. Now, what's interesting to observe here is the Roman critics who took notice of it and wrote about it. Celsus, I've already mentioned, he mocks Christians. He said, you guys attract a lower class. How can we even take you seriously? Although he was taking them seriously, ironically. Pliny, the governor of Bithynia and Pontus, writing around the year 111, we're talking one generation after the apostles, sends a letter to the emperor, Trajan at the time, saying, I've got a problem on my hands. Christians, they're starting to affect the entire society, especially the economy, because they're drying up temple merchandise trade and changing the culture that way just by their habits, their behaviors. And he wanted to know what to do, and he accused them of only one crime. You know what it was? Obstinacy. That's the word he uses. They were causing trouble. Although he did say some would forsake faith if threatened by torture, but not enough. The physician Galen, very famous in Greek philosophy and so on, was one of the inventors of modern medicine. He lived again in the 2nd century. He wrote about Christians. And he says their exemplary behavior makes them more ethical than philosophers. Now, I'm essentially an Augustinian in my view and reality. Somebody said I didn't mention Augustine last night, so I'm going to today. And here's this essential argument, and I think this is so profound. It gives us a kind of template by which to understand the biblical story, to say nothing of human history. There are always, he said, two stories unfolding in any given moment of history. He called them the two cities, two stories. One, the story of humanity's quest for meaning, influence, pleasure, power, and conquest without reference to God. It's what we do when God isn't around or we don't believe in God. The other is the story of God's redemptive work in the world. Now listen to this. There's only one stage upon which these stories unfold. There's only one set of props. There's only one set of characters, but two stories. And we're all acting in both, but not all of us know we are. Think of Pharaoh and Moses. Think of another Pharaoh and Joseph. Things are not always what they seem when events occur. Who could have imagined that the apostles, all Jews, would launch a movement that would become over time such a powerful force in all world history? If we had been watching it then, we wouldn't have come to that conclusion. Or who could have imagined that a few experiments in community living in the desert would produce the most stable, productive, and culturally powerful institution for over 500 years? The monastery. Then again, who could have imagined that a baby born in a stable in a small town located on the margins of the Roman Empire would set in motion events that would culminate in the salvation of the world? Think about the reality that Ruth experienced. What a story. This Midianite marries this Jewish refugee or immigrant, gets adopted by this family. Her father-in-law dies, her husband dies, and she chooses, out of loyalty to Naomi, to go to a country that isn't her own. She can't speak the language. She doesn't know anybody but Naomi. And then through a series of chance, or what we'd call providential events, she eventually marries a man who's a generation older, Boaz, and they have a child together, kind of comforting Naomi. And they name him, what do they name him? Not Boaz, but Obed. Obed grows up. By now, Boaz is long gone from the scene as an older man, maybe Ruth. And he grows up and has a son and names him Jesse. And Jesse grows up and he has 8 sons, the youngest of whom becomes the great king of Israel. Oh, but the story's not over with yet. Many generations later, another son is born. And his name is Jesus. Ruth had no idea. 2 stories. One stage, one set of props, one set of characters. Some 2,000 years ago, Caesar Augustus dominated the headlines of the ancient equivalent of Time and People magazine. Not Jesus. That was then. This is now. It looks very different in retrospect. Never before has this early history been more relevant than right now. I am absolutely convinced of that. For witnessing the fading of Western Christendom. Clearly, you see it in Europe, which I define as the symbiotic relationship between church and society, Christianity and culture. For centuries, everybody was Christian. Really. Even the Reformation, everybody was Christian. As I said, it was a family argument. That probably continued well into the 19th century. Christendom made the third way irrelevant because there was no first and second way, only the Christian way. And what do you do when it's the only way? Well, you just are Christian. Not that Christendom lacked serious Christians. We know there were many of them. We could name them here. Bernard, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, on and on it goes. The history of the church tells the story of countless renewal movements. Monastic, mendicant, Francis of Assisi, the Franciscans and Dominicans, the Pietists. I would urge you to read or reread Jacob Spainer's My Pious Desires. It's this tirade of passion addressed to the Lutheran Church, and he's writing to Christians. The Wesleyan movement, but these are all renewal movements that assume the existence of a Christendom. What they wanted to do as leaders was awaken a moribund Christendom. The unstated assumption behind these movements was that the Western world was Christian, just way too nominal and dead. I don't think we're living in that world anymore. Honest to God, I don't. Which is why the early Christian movement, it seems to me, has so much to teach us. There was competition. There's competition now, sometimes fierce. As long as Christians assume we're living in the old arrangement of Christendom, or can return to it through some kind of coercive move, like who we elect, the church will continue to decline in the West, no matter how ferociously Christians fight to maintain their power and privilege. You know, I've often thought, just because the White House calls us doesn't mean we have to go. If anything, the harder we claw and fight our way to power, the more precipitous the decline will be, for cultural power and privilege will come to us at an increasingly high price. I've come to the conclusion, tentatively maybe, that maybe the greatest enemy of Christianity in America is Christianity. Christians will either begin to accommodate until the faith becomes almost unrecognizable, or Christians will isolate until their faith becomes virtually invisible. As I said yesterday, even though I was severely mocked and abused for it. The early Christian movement, for the most part, with lots of exceptions, was never perfect, no golden age, was able to produce thick people, thick Christians, without the material advantages that we enjoy, like church buildings and other things of that sort. And they developed a process by which to do it. Now, I went to Fuller in the 70s. And I took a 3-semester church history class under Jeffrey Bromley. He was a wonderful man, although very odd. And I learned a great deal. In early Christianity, we almost exclusively studied heresies, Arian, so on. We looked at the Middle Ages very briefly and concentrated a little bit on monasticism in St. Thomas Aquinas. A lot of time on the Reformation and the Evangelical Awakenings. And then, to bring it up to date, we spent a lot of time thinking about Barth, Bultmann, Brunner, and Bonhoeffer. And I'm not dismissing that. It was a valuable education, and I'm grateful for it. But I learned a word about 30 years later. When I was in my early 50s, I had never heard before. I mentioned this to some of you. I knew the word catechism. Who couldn't? If you're from a Reformation tradition, they produced like 55 of them in about a 60-year period of time, all Q&A. Every one of those catechisms was Q&A, somewhere between 25 and 75 pages. The best, in my opinion, was the Dutch Heidelberg, but that's another story altogether. You Presbyterians with the Westminster Confession, ooh, a little severe, but never mind. I'm not talking about catechisms. I'm talking about a word that many of you do know, and that's the catechumenate. Why had not I heard of that word when it was the major method the entire early Christian period used to train people as disciples? Well, we didn't have to learn it in the 1970s. Did you know that the peak period of mainline Christianity in America was 1978? We, as mainliners, if you call yourself or consider yourself that, had over 30% of the adult population of America in our churches. The adult population, not just Christians, 30% of everybody. No other group has gotten to that height since then, except for the nuns. N-O-N-E-S. There was good reason why they developed this tool, and your imagination should be able to arrive at this right away. Imagine what it's like when you move beyond Judaism and to begin to make your way into the pagan Roman world, cities like Corinth and Ephesus. I mean, you can read between the lines when you're reading the book of Corinth, can't you? Or Corinthians, can't you? The 2 books. Full of trouble because they carried so much of their pagan background into the Christian fold in church. And it caused a lot of trouble. Christians were starting from scratch. Imagine what it would be like to work with a population of people who knew nothing about the Christian story. Nothing. Adam, Eve, Moses, Abraham, Esther, Ruth, the prophets, Jesus, nothing. But even more challenging was the fact that they didn't even understand the categories. Fall, redemption, forgiveness, grace, nothing. So the immediate baptism that the early Christian movement practiced, say Pentecost, Cornelius, the Ethiopian eunuch, for the most part, it seems they were dealing with people who were either Jews or fellow traveling Jews, had Jewish sympathies. They did know the story. I mean, when the Ethiopian eunuch was was reading in his chariot, it was not pulp fiction. It was the book of Isaiah. It just happened to be Isaiah 53, quite convenient for Philip. When they entered the Roman world, that wasn't a luxury to them anymore. So what happens is by the middle of the 2nd century or earlier, they're delaying baptism by 2 or 3 years. First, because they have to baptize them into something that's meaningful to them, something they have to understand, and also because the possibility of persecution always hovered over them. And they developed a training program, I call it like a long on-ramp, that moved them from the world of paganism into the world of Christianity. Or view it as a long bridge, not a little boarded bridge, but something like Golden Gate or even longer, where you're linking two land masses that are a great distance from each other, like crossing the Grand Canyon, something like that. It's the only way they could do it. They discovered that it was both inherent in the Christian worldview. I mean, to them, discipleship was part of the deal. It wasn't like a secondary decision they made. Knowing Jesus and following and imitating Jesus was all part of a larger whole. It was just in the water. It was in the air. It was the whole, part of the whole package. We've tended to break that up so we have kind of levels of membership, often unstated in churches, from the serious people to people who'd show up every once in a while. For some reason, they couldn't afford to do that in the early Christian period. And it was also necessary because of the kind of pressure they were under all the time. So you see this reading between the lines as early as the Didache. There's a telling phrase in the Didache. This is the first Christian manual written around the year 100, probably Syrian. And they have instructions on baptism, for example, where you get water and even what the temperature is, a little bizarre. Instructions on the Eucharist, beautiful language, by the way, that we still use as grain is gathered from 1,000 fields and so on. That's all from the Didache. They talk about the threat of itinerant evangelists because they were sometimes deceiving people. So you see in the Didache that they're leaning toward the pastor and long-term ministry rather than itinerance. So there are a lot of interesting elements in that. But here's the most telling thing. The whole book begins, short book by the way, begins by describing the two ways. There's the way of life and there's the way of death. And it's 4 or 5 pages long. And basically it's warmed over Sermon on the Mount. And then when he gives instructions about baptism, he says something like this. After you have led them in the instruction in the two ways, then. Now, what is he saying there? You had to introduce them not simply to who Jesus was, but to the Jesus way of life. There's more evidence by the time you get to Justin Martyr, certainly Origen. By the 4th century, it's everywhere. We have collections of catechetical sermons from probably 8 or 9 church fathers. All of, Cyril of Jerusalem, Ambrose, Augustine, Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, great cat name in my mind, but never mind that. Theodore of Mopsuestia, and there are a bunch of others. We have all those sermons, or I should say all the teachings. Cyril spent 80 lessons on telling or retelling the Christian story. So this became practice in the 2nd century, and then the second church manual we have, the apostolic tradition, outlines it in detail. And let me explain it to you very briefly. Some of you have heard me do this before, and I'll be quick. First, there was an enrollment period. Yes, enrollment period. People would come who were curious about being Christians, and they were curious because they had gotten to know a Christian. I mean, could show up in church. It was all relational. And when you go to an ancient city that's been excavated, you notice the number of public places that people enjoyed, including the agora or marketplace. There was a survey taken of the city of Rome around the year 300. The survey says there were about 1,800 domiciles. That's homes, single-family homes, mostly mansions. 43,000 apartment buildings. And they were bleak and dark and cold or hot and smoky and smelly. Rich people had plumbing, poor people didn't. They had to use chamber pots. So people lived outdoors. And one of the great places to hang out was the agora, the marketplace, because everybody was there, or other public spaces like that. So this is how it works. You know, you have people who are serious Christians, and they have a stall in the marketplace. And they're friendly and lively and interesting. But you, a pagan, notice right away that the merchant has 4 daughters and no sons. And he likes those daughters. And you're shocked that he kept all 4. Because they practiced exposure. They didn't really want more than 1 or 2 daughters. It's too expensive. And in Roman law, the father had 8 days to decide the fate of that baby after birth. So you're immediately curious. Then you notice no gods, no goddesses, no statuary of any kind. You remember you've never seen him in the temple or stopping at shrines. Something is different. That family finally invites you over for dinner, and what do they do before mealtime? They pray in the name of Jesus. Well, you get attracted. You like their quality of life. You like how they treat other people. And you finally say, what do you believe? You become a candidate to be a catechumen. And you appear before a leader of the church. Now, don't think you're in some kind of office building or office in a church building. You're probably sipping coffee or something in an open space. Well, tell me, Derek, how you got interested in this, they'll ask you. You give some kind of story. And we'll just say Troy is your friend, Christian friend. Troy, can you just talk about Derek a little bit, how you got to know him, and why you think he's ready to become a catechumen? They did that with every candidate. And they would do a kind of intake interview. If Derek was a gladiator, he probably needed to find a different kind of job. If he was, say, it was a woman and she was a prostitute, Troy would say, you're going to have to stop that occupation. We'll find another job for you. That's the kind of thing they did. Anyway, intake interview, and then you'd be enrolled, and then you'd go through a 1 to 3 year training program. There would be instruction, or better, training in the biblical story, because you couldn't really understand your story unless you understand the story. Basically, a short version of the Apostles' Creed, basic Christian doctrine, and ethics, the Christian way of life. Sermon on the Mount, 10 Commandments, that sort of thing. At the end of that process, you would go through what was called the rites of initiation, and that would be launched with 2 things that are very foreign to us. The first is exorcisms. They would cast out demons. And they would interview you again. So back to Derek, I would say, tell me what you believe, Derek. Do you believe that God is your true father? Yes, I do believe that. Do you believe that Jesus is his son and he came to die and save? Yes, yes. Holy Spirit, yeah. You get all that straight. But then there would be another set of interview questions. When Troy goes to visit prisons with food, have you been going with him? Have you been taking care of orphans? Inviting widows into your home? Now, when we hear that, we get nervous. That sounds so, what, legalistic? But it wasn't to them, it was just a way of life. We don't call coaches legalistic if they force their athletes to practice 25 free throws at the end of practice. It's just being a basketball player. Well, that's what it was like for them. And after that period, they would go through, they'd fast, baptismal rite on early Easter Sunday morning, and then immediately a confirmation, anointing of oil, and then they'd go into the church gathering for their first Eucharist. And a little later on in the process, maybe by the year 300, they would be served the food of the kingdom, milk and honey. And then they would be exhorted with this. And with these things have been accomplished, let each one be zealous to perform good works and to please God, living righteously, devoting himself to the church and performing the things which he has learned, advancing in the service of God. Well, you could just imagine what this did over a period of 270 years. As the movement inches further into the Roman world, especially into urban centers, and they're producing people through discipline and grace and mentoring, because everybody was a mentor in this, or became one, how that would begin to affect the culture. 5,000 to 5 million. And by then, of course, for Rome, it was too late. Constantine was just a really smart guy to accommodate to this movement. Now, don't we see hints of this even in the book of Acts? Look at Peter's sermon in Acts 2. He quotes the Bible all over the place because he's speaking to a Jewish audience. Look at Paul's sermon in Acts 17. Never even mentions the name Jesus and never quotes the Bible. He quotes a pagan poet to try to find some kind of common ground. Now, during this whole period, as I mentioned yesterday, the Christian movement maintained a fierce independence. And mostly everything that we consider formative in Christianity was formed during that period. Liturgy, canon, offices, ecclesiastical hierarchy, doctrines, creeds, everything. And in my mind, we have to be fiercely independent as Christians today. So we're operating on our own terms. Now, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have even thought this in the 1970s and 80s, but I've landed here now. I think we need a new long on-ramp into the Christian fold. I just don't think we can assume as much as we used to. You know, in the old days, it was, a former Methodist that lands in your church and wants a little more liturgy, and you do a weekend new members class and you're good to go. And I'm not being cynical with that at all. That makes perfect sense to me because you could assume quite a bit. They needed to become a little bit more reformed, but that'll happen in time. I don't know if we can do that anymore. So I'm going to conclude with this. About 3 years ago, I started playing with developing a new catechumenate. And I did. It's 30 chapters. It's very formational, but it's not a workbook. And 9 communities of people, 8 churches and some college students are using it right now. It's a year's experiment. It's a Word document. The senior pastor had to buy in and be involved. We have Zoom calls every 3 months to evaluate what's happening. I'll give you a sample. There's Assemblies of God Church in Spokane that has about 25 people in it, all adults. There's a Church of England church plant in Nottingham using it, as part of their leadership material for new Christians, because the average age of this church, planted 7 years ago, it has about 800 people now. The average age is 25, mostly new Christians. Let me see, there are a couple of churches that are using it just with their staffs. And they're finding themselves appalled at how little staff members know, but that's another matter altogether. Anyway, I'm taking detailed notes, and I had a friend who's a church planter in Vancouver, BC, really, really great guy, who said, here's what you need to do, Jerry, because he's read it. You can revise a book a little bit, but it's really, really solid. I don't have much to say about that. His words, not mine. It's clear, winsome, pithy. It has coherence to it. It's like one thing. But you need to take all the formation material and put it on a website. And after every chapter, drive them to the website. So you'll have a backbone that will be biblical study, memorization, because I require that after every chapter, and a spiritual exercise to practice. And that's simple and not terribly rigorous, but will have a cumulative effect over a long period of time. Here's one of them. You realize that Didache prescribed saying the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day by the year 100. I find it amusing that somebody sold 10 million copies trying to improve on the Lord's Prayer by writing the prayer of Jabez. Like we're going to trade out Jesus and go with something in Kings. It's just a bad idea, in my opinion. Although he's laughing all the way to the bank, I think. That's another issue altogether. So a spiritual practice, but then he said what you can do is have them land on other icons for each chapter. A film to watch, a short document to read, a podcast to listen to, something from the Gospel Project. What is the Gospel Project? What is that? Bible Project, so on and so forth. So I'm going to play with that over the summer and see. I'm not advertising it. Right now it's being used and being tested. If you're interested, let me know. Give me your email. I'll send it to you, but I'm not holding my breath, and I'm not recruiting you. This is really God's business. At 75, I don't really care what happens much anymore, as long as I can be with my grandchildren every day. But this God has laid on my heart. This is really, it sounds awfully noble and spiritual. I'm just going to say, I feel like it's a spiritual mandate. It's something I have to do. So anyway, I'm appealing to you, not for this, but to think about what it would mean for you to develop a long on-ramp into the life of your church. Like a year. And start small. Really small. And then plan on 5 years, minimum, to begin to change the culture. From a culture of consumerism or habit to a culture of real discipleship that has not one drop of legalism in it. Now, you've been very gracious. I've gone a long time tonight. I'm sorry for that. Well, actually, I'm not sorry for it, but I appreciate your gracious attentiveness. And I haven't even seen many heads bob, and I appreciate that quite a bit. We can have maybe 1 or 2 questions. Jared, is that okay, or should we just quit? I'm okay if we do. All right, maybe a couple. Anybody? Well, let's go with Troy, and then with well, let's start with you because you were overlooked last time. We don't want to marginalize you.
Just really simply, was there a different catechumen among the Eastern churches, and what point did that take place, and et cetera?
Well, it's a very intelligent question. It shows that you know there was an Eastern and Western, which I appreciate right there. That's a holdover from your seminary days. Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking, we had the Greek fathers, many more of them, and then we had the Latin fathers. First one being Tertullian, then Cyprian, and so on. It was all over. We find as much evidence in the East as we do in the West, in Greek and in Latin, and there's a lot of overlap. So it's not like they're meeting somewhere, it's organic. It's just kind of moving. As everybody's coming to the same conclusion, what do we do with these pagan converts that don't know what they're converted to? And live lives that are so base compared to a Christian worldview and a Christian ethic, it's going to take us a while. It's kind of like raising a child. You need all 18 years. Now, for me, I only needed 4 or 5, but for the average, you kidding me? See, so what's fascinating is that the documentation is not very extensive early, but then it explodes, and you realize that this stuff has just been permeating everywhere because they all basically come to the same conclusion. Troy?
With the early catechumenate, where does the practice of child and infant baptism come into play? If you're training these catechumenists to be
great question.
baptized?
Okay, so there's all kinds of little pieces of evidence. There's arguments among the church fathers. Tertullian was dead against it. Origen argued, look, if we can baptize sinful adults, why wouldn't we want to baptize innocent children? That's a stupid idea. It's kind of a good argument, actually. It wasn't a settled issue for a long, long time. Having said that, there's a telling phrase in the apostolic tradition, and it says this: when you're baptizing, baptize the women first, then the children, and if a child is not old enough to speak for himself or herself, the parent can do it for them. Well, I don't know what that means. Is it a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old? But it indicates that there seems to be cross-generational baptism going on, maybe families doing baptism, and adults, sponsors, godparents, they were the same thing. We call them mentors today. Or a parent is speaking on behalf of the child. That's the best I can do. An argument and at least one piece of evidence that there were children being baptized.
And when would you place that piece of evidence?
It was around the year 200, but in any typical church manual, it evolves over time. But we know that the first use of it was in the early 3rd century in Rome. Pardon? And then the men. Yeah. Yes, sir. Wait a minute, let's wait.
Let's get this. The third question for the third way.
I have an interesting thing happening at my church, not anything that I tried to do or foment. I have young men mostly coming to our church, being driven there by a podcast called Reformed Zoomer, looking for a deeper Reformed faith,
Yeah.
and desiring to be in, we have a Zoom meeting twice a month. I'm wondering, with this guy telling you need to be online and stuff. And it seems like every week there's another guy showing up and he says, yeah, I want to be here. I want to be a part of this thing. And they just take him in and start to, they're discipling each other. And I'm kind of running along with them.
Yeah, I was just going to say, they need you.
Yeah.
Young men need you.
But it's interesting that there's this kind of wave of young men.
Well, actually, there's a statistical trend here that among Gen Zs, it's more men that are going back to church than women. Now, what we need to do is help these men be good to women, and they'll probably want to come back to church too. But as long as they're sexist and take cold showers and eat nothing but raw meat and lift weights, what they need to do is ask girls out to date for dates and propose and get married and learn to be good fathers.
Yeah.
Did I offend you guys? Oh, good. Well, I don't mind you, Eric. I'm sorry if I offended you. And make their beds. Yeah, I'm sounding a little like who's the goofball up in Toronto, but
I'm wondering how much you really kind of have looked at what's happening with young women and how radically woke that has So
Yeah,
that
it's
really
radically
this diverse
woke.
kind of thing. So you're talking to kind of laying it on the men, but I think there's as much to say about what's happening with women.
Sure there is. Sure there is. I mean, I think that it works both ways. It's interesting that there's a lot of talk about natalism these days. The Trump administration is really trying to advocate marriage and larger family size and kind of traditional roles and that sort of thing. That's coming out all over the place. And they cite Viktor Orban in Hungary as a good example of that because he has put tons of money into rewarding families that have many children. I think if you have more than 4, you don't have to pay taxes or something pretty radical that way. But here's the statistical interesting thing. Since 2019, birth rates in Hungary have gone down. And the reason why is women don't want to lose some of the rights they've already been able to enjoy. Working, getting an education. I advocate going back to Ephesians 5. Husbands, love your wives. Live like Jesus did. I think that would make a lot more women likely to want to marry and marry earlier and have children. If they knew a husband would actually do the dishes and do some of the cooking, that might help a lot. Now, I'm not releasing them from responsibility. There are problems both ways, I admit that. Yeah. Eric. I'm sensing trouble
I have
by
6
that
questions,
tone.
and they're all long and complicated questions because I know we want to be here for probably another half hour.
No.
So
why don't
I'm
we,
actually-
why
I
don't
had a
we
question,
continue
but I-
this as in a private conversation?
No, yeah. No, I was just going to make a comment. Does that speak to the futility of top-down solutions? Because the early Christian movement was
Pretty much bottom up.
salt and light,
Yeah.
and that's what changed the world.
I mean, obviously, in fact, tomorrow morning I'm going to talk about, today was unique people, so we had the meeting that changed the world, unique God, unique people. Tomorrow I'm going to talk about a unique culture because Christianity produced a very unique culture, and we're all the beneficiaries of it. But the minute you become overly aggressive and coercive, the minute you assume God is on your side and stop asking whether you're on God's side, the abuse of authority and power is terrible because you can't be wrong if you've got God on your side. And that's why Christian history after Constantine, especially after about the year 1100, becomes such a mixed bag. I mean, it produces Francis of Assisi and it produces the Inquisition. It kind of goes both ways. But I'm very bullish on a Christian capacity to create glorious culture. But it tends to do best when it's going this way rather than this way. Yeah. Anyway, more about that tomorrow morning. You're amazing. I really appreciate you a lot. And I want to say I'm really serious about this one. I think this is the need of the hour. So my assignment for you, the challenge I've given you, now this is the third. The first is, what does a mature Christian look like considering circumstances? The second one is take Luke and preach through it for 6 months and let it tell its own story. Get out of the way and see what happens to the congregation. And the third is, can you start dreaming maybe with elders or staff, I don't care how old or young your church is, how big or small, some kind of pathway that really almost starts from scratch. Do with it what you will. Let me pray. Lord, bless us. Bless these good people. Inspire them. Fortify them. Give them hope. Renew their love for you and their love for the church and their love for their church. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Okay, thank you.
Remember, we have an extended Q&A tomorrow night, so come with your questions.